Welcome to the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast. I'm your regular host, Nate Cooper, and with me this season, I have Eve McKnight as my co-host. This season of Cut Your Learning Curve is sponsored by Swarm NYC, a digital product design agency and management consultancy. Swarm helps you connect the dots and mitigate the risks associated with launching a digital product, website, or idea. Thanks for joining me, Eve. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Eve McKnight. I teach about project management all over the United States with my company, Little Owl, and I'm also the Director of Learning here at Swarm.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me, Eve. If you're new to the podcast, Cut Your Learning Curve is where we help you rethink how you can learn new skills that benefit your professional career and the projects that you want to develop. So let's jump into the episode. So this episode, we are talking about hackathons. And for each episode this season, what we are doing is starting with a kind of a framing question for each topic. So the framing question we have for hackathons is, what is a hackathon and how does it provide a model, whether positive or negative, for the future of work? So Eve was really excited to talk about this topic. I know I have a lot of thoughts on it, but I guess, what do you want to hear first, Eve, from me about hackathons, or what interests you about hackathons and why do you want to talk about it?
Well, so Nate and I, every week, we sort of bounce around topics and we sort of come up with different ideas. And Nate has mentioned for a while now his genuine and deep love of hackathons. I know you've run a few, and I think just talking about your experience with it, how many you've run, what are your strongest memories, why do you really think they're valuable?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too, because I think there's different levels within the hackathon world even. So, and I don't know much about sort of like the current state of things. It's been a while since I've been an organizer for hackathons, but I can kind of frame it with like, what is a hackathon? So typically a hackathon is just a 3-day event. They can last longer, but generally speaking, it's a discrete amount of time, less than a week. So 3 days is like a good format. The idea is that you have a group of people who show up, who fit into a few different categories, who are all interested in building a new project. And those categories can vary depending on the sort of the theme of the hackathon. But generally speaking, you have people who have design backgrounds, people who have engineering backgrounds, people who have marketing backgrounds or business backgrounds. And the mix of those people can vary depending on the point of the hackathon. Some hackathons are more engineering focused. They want to build an engineering product. Some hackathons are more business focused, so they want to build a prototype and a business model. And you know, the stuff like Startup Weekend, which is a format like that, I kind of qualify as a hackathon, even though it's a little bit more business and minded. But then if you go to like a IBM hackathon, you know, for Watson or something like that, that's going to be much more of an engineering heavy hackathon. But roughly speaking, the idea is like in these 3 days, these strangers, they get together, they have no idea who they are. People pitch ideas and you have to come up with a project, usually on day one, and then form a team. And then by day 3, you are having to present the finished product. So, you know, whether that's a business model with a working prototype or some new app that you've built over the course of the last day and a half, 2 days, you know, designs, all that sort of stuff. So my experience with organizing hackathons was I was first a participant and then an organizer for this hackathon called Startup Bus, which was it's actually like a global event, and their startup buses, it was unique in that it was a hackathon on a bus, if you catch from the name. And you know, the way it worked is we had like different buses from different regions. So we have, depending on the year, people from New York, people from San Francisco, people from Mexico, people sometimes from Canada, Midwest. So yeah, so basically the hackathon, it's on a bus, and the idea is that these different buses have origin cities, and they all converge somewhere in the middle, usually in Texas or somewhere in the South. We did like Nashville, we did Austin, and the idea is that basically every bus has its own set of developers, designers, and business people. And at the end of it, basically there's a pitch competition where people have to basically pitch their idea to investors. And like, depending on the year, we had some pretty high profile judges. Guy Kawasaki was there one of the years that I organized, and he was one of the judges. And it was just a really interesting experience because you go from like, I don't know any of these people and I'm just getting on this bus to some place to like, we have a working business that we are going to be talking to real investors about within 3 days. So that's kind of the format of a hackathon and my experience with it.
I mean, I was just curious really more from a dynamics perspective. So I'm guessing it was like a nice bus with bathrooms and tables?
Yeah, I mean, depending on the region, they had different quality of buses, but actually, yeah, the New York bus was always really nice. I actually know the guy who owns the bus company. And yeah, it was like there were like tables and Wi-Fi on the bus generally, and a bathroom. You do make stops, so like we weren't like sleeping on the bus. So it was
that was
like,
my question.
Yeah, it was definitely interesting. You know, buses kind of converge on a random hotel in the middle of nowhere, and then everybody just pulls out their laptops and starts coding or doing work, you know, in the middle of the lobby kind of thing. So it's quite an experience. It's like a road trip hackathon.
I have not heard of the road trip aspect, so that was something new for me.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, so clearly there's, you know, that while that aspect, I mean, the hackathons that I've seen or know about really are much more typically in one location. So I definitely think that adds a whole layer of just logistical challenges, but great. Yeah. And you know, the whole thing with developers, and my understanding is at least that the idea is that we block out external stimuli. That's part of the point of a hackathon. So, you know, you're not putting kids to bed, you're not figuring out dinner. It's all taken care of for you, and you're just there to focus and kind of drop in and flow.
Right.
Nate and I talk about flow, and just really work in these uninterrupted intervals of time.
Yeah, for sure. And I think part of that, I think you're right. Definitely, like a lot of it relates to the work and just having time to focus on the work. But I think it also does a lot for team building. I mean, whether you're on a bus moving around or whether you're sort of locked in a building, generally you're not locked in the building. But the idea is like you're sort of have to work through dynamics of team forming that typically, you know, if you're talking on the scale of a business, might happen over several months. You're kind of drastically accelerating that timeline because you have, you know, it depends on the hackathon, but, you know, teams generally can be anywhere from like 3 people to like maybe 6 people on the high end. And there's dynamics, you know, there's different people who have different skills, and each skill is kind of weighted differently, and then depending on the goals, like, you know, whose vision wins out. You know, if you have 2 people kind of similar skill sets, how do they divide up the work? I think, you know, when it comes to engineers, I think in some ways it's an adaptable skill set to have to like divvy up pretty easily, but when it comes to things like design or marketing, you get a lot of personalities with that. So you know, I think it's that sort of sharing a space is an important element of it, because you force people to kind of like have to learn how to work together in a short span of time. Because think of like your group project in college, you know, you're sort of like, you chose your lab partner 5 hours ago and your final presentation is due tomorrow. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that. So there's a lot that I see in terms of just how people have to figure out how to work together, being a component of it, along with the work. You know what I mean?
Definitely. And I mean, I think actually that's another reason why basically I feel like part of my job in this discussion is just to sort of compare it to other things, is, you know, some of those escape rooms, which have become also a very popular sort of trendy thing, and are much, much shorter in terms of time. They don't usually last a day. They last an hour or 2, and are in fact sometimes a safety hazard, but that's a separate issue. You know, there's also something to be said about, and actually is somewhat similar in the sense that they're in this physical space and they have a very specific problem to solve, in this case, getting out of the room. And, you know, they leverage each other's skill sets in order to do so. I think something also that I would imagine, Nate, is, you know, part of the appeal of this is the the roles are very fluid of the people. It's sort of like once you're inside the hackathon, well, first of all, if you're on a bus, you're physically separated from the rest of the world by the bus. But if you do it locked in a room somewhere, hopefully not locked, but you're in like the third floor of an office building somewhere, you really are sort of separated from other things happening. I think it allows a certain kind of focus as well.
Oh, totally. Yeah. No, completely. And yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right in that doing it on a mobile hackathon, I think adds layers of tension that wouldn't be there, if you were in a stable physical space. But I think the challenges remain about needing to really be fluid with your working style and figuring out what's possible and what's not possible, and like having to work out, how do you sort of like come to an agreement on what your plan is? You know what I mean? And there's like a rhythm to these things where teams form generally on the first day, or often like the first evening on Friday night. And then sometime like Saturday afternoon, you have people who are just like, oh man, what did I sign up for? I hate my team members. I hate this project. This is not what I thought I was doing. I need to go do something else, kind of thing. And things can kind of like happen like that, where there's just personalities that get involved, because there is a lot of like pushing outside your comfort zone. And some people really step up to that in some ways. And it's not even just on them necessarily. Sometimes you just get asked to do stuff that is just too much, or you kind of came in with a particular vision of what you wanted to get out of it, and things turn in a different direction. And you suddenly have to, be confronted with like, well, do I still want to be part of this or whatever? And so there's these natural rhythms that happen over the course of 3 days that, again, might be something that's just an accelerated version of what can happen over like a couple months or years in like a career. But it's just like people kind of fall out of love with the idea, or the direction has changed, and then they have to confront their own interest. And in those moments, I think it really forces people to, to confront these difficult things in I would say generally a safe environment. I mean, the difference between that and working in a job is that like this is a thing you're doing on a weekend in your free time, and you probably paid to go to. I mean, like if your company shifts directions and you're no longer happy with your job or your work, I mean, that's a much deeper problem in a way than like, hey, your hackathon project didn't go the way you wanted to. But it's a similar kind of thing you have to confront, I think, as an individual. Is like, do I want to be doing this? Like, you have designers who have to suddenly take on new coding challenges, or like developers who have to learn how to deal with business language, you know what I mean? And things like that force people to really push out of their comfort zones, which is, I think, a good thing. It's a sort of a safe way to confront things that might otherwise be much harder to deal with in the real world,
No, and I can definitely see the advantages to that. I teach a series of topics, and certainly one of them, whether it's team building in a project management space, or just I talk a lot about meeting management in one of my courses, where I talk about running meetings specifically, is that certainly as a society, especially since the internet began, even more so with smartphones, we just are not, we don't, if the benefit of the 20th century was the benefit and challenge of the 20th century was rise of nationalism, certainly the challenge of the 21st century is the rise of the individual and individualism, and people talk about this in all different kinds of contexts. And, even in the armed forces, they say, it used to be that you would be in these trenches and there was nothing else. And now people live on their phones, and actually, heads of army have reported that there is just not the same like cohesion with these soldiers. And that's life or death. I mean, that is not, a weekend hackathon.
Right.
And I think what the advantages, of what Nate was talking about when it does go well, certainly is, it is those 4 stages of forming, norming, storming, and performing, and sort of how that happens and how we develop as a group. And especially now, at least in the Northeast where we live, very few people are really going back to work in an office. It's not... Right. It's certainly not the majority culture of office workers, at least here in New York. So I think there's a lot of offices really trying, and office environments really trying to figure out how can we generate, especially given the pretty normal turnover of workforce, and especially now that we're over 6 months in, how do you create team dynamics without a physical space? I mean, it's the reason we have these, what I call superstar cities in the first place, is to have so much talent in the same physical zone, despite there being the internet. So I think there's something very real to all of that in terms of human dynamics and team forming.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a good question too. It's just like, what does a hackathon look like? Not like virtually or whatever. But I think there is something about just being in a physical space that does sort of force you to go through those team dynamics in a way that is different than remote work for sure. I was also thinking about, just in terms of like, you were kind of talking about soldiers and stuff, and I feel like the way people have talked about Startup Bus is like, it's like going to war kind of thing, where it's like they don't quite use that language, but it is kind of like an experience, and because people have this shared experience together, they form these bonds more closely. So there's all kinds of like, if you think about team dynamics in terms of like a skill building thing, and that how important that is for a career, that's great. But then if you just talk about just the connections you make and how important that is for a career, I think that's another really, really, really important piece of like what a hackathon does for people who participate, because those who kind of like get in there and get to work, you're showing off your talent. And I mean, it's no secret that the reason why a lot of these companies like Google, or IBM sponsor these things is because they're trying to recruit, developers, and that's become like a big recruitment channel for engineering teams. But from an individual perspective, I think just the informal networking that you get because you've done something, because you're working on something. I mean, it's just so much different than like what we think of as traditional networking, as like, oh, we went to a cocktail party after work or whatever and had to mingle with people. There is sometimes that. I mean, usually hackathons have some element of food, or, it's famous for like, you throw pizzas in a room and 2 liters of Coke, and like you got a hackathon. And but there is an element of like just normal socializing that's part of it, but I think it's hyper elevated in a way because you have to work on a project together with people. There is a sense of accomplishment that I think goes into it, and that same sort of like, oh, we've been through similar things. And I mean, just as an example, like the company I run right now, Swarm, that Eve is a contractor for at the moment, like I met the founders of Swarm through the hackathon I organized, and they met each other through the hackathon that they were in. So, I mean, all of the, like, so many great business opportunities and a lot of the network that I know and benefit from professionally over the past, 10 years or whatever has come from, the hackathon sort of community that grew out of that. I don't think all hackathons necessarily have that. I think a lot of so-called communities, it's tough to like have a real authentic community for those people who like understand what goes into building a community around an event or a company or a brand or whatever. But that said, I think that the communities that form around hackathons are really strongly bonded in a way that it's different than having just met at a cocktail party and like introduced somebody randomly. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, for that specific instance, I totally agree. And something else I also, I try to mimic as much as I can in my classes. Like I do a fair bit of gamification, which with different environments, but in general, people just can't get enough of it. If the game is effective and understandable and clearly reward based. And, I just wholeheartedly think, especially if it's this idea that they've really set aside some time, like a few days, and there's a significant reward at the end, i.e. achievement of this goal. Maybe
right.
Reward's the wrong term. That is a very real experience, and not for nothing, but certainly at least engineers are known for not being the most social people in the world. So it does provide an environment. I mean, whether fair or not, salespeople by and large tend to be highly, highly, highly social in very specific ways. And they work on those skills and they practice those skills and they cultivate those skills because there's a real financial incentive for them to do so. And typically they also enjoy it. And, and just what I see with engineers is a real reluctance to necessarily develop one's skills in small talk. And so as a result, like also, or even the value of that kind of social lubricant, even in the first place. And wholeheartedly, like I think once you build something with someone else, you do remember.
Right.
And also, again, this idea of spending so much physical time, not only the location, but the time itself, the dedicated time together in this commonality of a common goal. That sentence wasn't great, but in towards this common goal, it's bigger than just networking. It's this thing on a deeper level, which will stick with you if it's a rewarding experience. It can be. And I mean, it's not the same for everyone, but there's just something really meaningful about it. I think you'll remember it for more than just the networking. And that's why, I mean, I've never even heard of this as a data study, but like I would bet if anyone was able to do a really meaningful study around sort of contacts created, if there was such a way to do this with accounting for variables, like contacts built and created only through something like a hackathon versus contacts created only through something very superficial like 30 or 45 minutes at a meetup or a company or industry-wide gathering in Las Vegas where you have a name tag and you talk to somebody for 5 minutes. Yeah, I mean, it would be really interesting to even look at like how those contacts for you linger 5, 10, 15 years. So I also think it builds trust.
Definitely. Oh, yeah. And I love how you mentioned the gamification because competition is a big part of hackathons. Yeah, I mean, and some have like real financial rewards, and there's money prizes that people win. But I think the value of the competition is sort of like the difference between playing a team sport versus shooting hoops on your own. You know what I mean? It's that like, you might go through the same ropes, but doing it with other people like really bonds you in a way that's very different than, as you said, like a more formal setting or something like that. So I think there's so much to that exercise of having that sort of shared experience that it deepens the relationship, I think, in a way that I think people undervalue maybe on a topical level, because it's not just about connections. It's not just about people on LinkedIn, but people that you know and trust, and that you meet and you kind of instantly know, oh, you've done this, I've done that, we kind of have done something similar together and sharing that. And I think the last thing that I feel is really like valuable that I was thinking about in terms of hackathons is just when I think about learning, I always, when I do code training, like when I teach classes on coding, I always encourage my students to go to hackathons because, it's a safe space to fail. And I think that part of it, kind of like the same way that I think you're bringing gamification into learning, that kind of stuff is really invaluable to helping sort of learners prototype what they're capable of and letting them kind of like move and progress at their own pace,
And I also think, certainly as a learning environment, one, not only the safe space idea of it and this idea of sharing and also common goal, I also think too, again, like we've been talking about from the beginning, for some, it can be also uncomfortable pushing people outside their comfort zone, but there's nobody who is an assistant to someone in a hackathon. That doesn't exist, right? So you're not just sitting behind somebody taking notes all day and getting them coffee. Like you're doing real things. You're part of you're very much part of it. And I think that can be, I think when it goes well, when it achieves its ideals, I think it can be great. I think it can be very empowering for individuals, not only as a safe space, but as a chance to try new things, explore new things, and learn things to build trust, to build connections. I do think the best of what hackathons have to offer, getting to future of work, is really a lot of what you see in tech companies, in the way they design physical space, in the way they structure their teams. Like Spotify is very famous for, it's considered an agile company, and basically how they work is they have a series of small teams, usually 8 to 12 people or less, and they each are very dedicated teams working on one feature alone of the Spotify app, and they essentially function like mini startups. And so that they're just sort of constantly in that bubble. And I also think the whole idea of open office, which to me kind of looks like a hackathon, makes a lot of sense to me. And also this idea that, we can be very flexible and we can move very, very quickly, which also hackathons do, right? You cover an astonishing amount of ground in a couple days. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. Absolutely.
That said, I do think there are also limitations. So the first one, just the very nuts and bolts basic of a hackathon on a bus for 3 days, let's say from a Thursday to a Sunday, just at its on like a very sort of basic level, it's really going to be exclusionary to the same populations that struggle across the board, right? The disabled, the elderly. There is a huge tech bias in tech, really under age 40 and younger, right? We see that all the time. It's not a secret. I could see potentially anyone LGBT or transgender that didn't really feel comfortable with this environment. Another one also is just who can afford to do that? Who can afford to leave their family for 3 days and go off and do this? We're in a point right now in the United States, we're about 10% food insecure. So is there really somebody from that population, even if they're an excellent coder, who could legitimately go off and do this or has the money to do it? I just think, and also sort of this basic level of competency. I'm just assuming that, you have to sort of prove you have this basic skill set to be part of the hackathon, right?
Yeah, I mean, it varies by the hackathon. I mean, like something like Startup Weekend, for example, like you don't have to be very technical. I mean, that's much more like business focused, for example, because it's about building like a business model in a weekend rather than a technology product. So it kind of varies. I mean, some of the hackathons have an explicit kind of engineering, technical, sort of spin to them or objective to them, whereas other ones are a little bit more business focused. The one that I was talking about, Startup Bus, was kind of a balance. So there was like a certain amount of business people that we took, a certain amount of engineers we took, a certain amount of designers we took. So it kind of depends on who's organizing it, what the particular outcomes are.
Yeah. And I just think, and actually, I know there are certainly hackathons out there specifically geared towards women, people of colors, things like that.
Right.
But, it's just it's really kind of baked into the internet in the first place. Like the people who founded the internet were people who could afford to have computers and people who were of a certain education level. And so, and were capable of coding and was by and large a very specific demographic. And it's always been interesting to me that, like something I read a year or two ago was that the big next wave of apps in a country like India, population 1.3 billion, was going to be mobile apps for people who are illiterate and who can't read at all, people who work in trains, people who deliver lunches, things like this. And that there's a population of millions like that in India. And I actually even could see a hackathon building out apps and thinking about those problems, but it's just unlikely that they would be in the space of the building. And actually, that's even a broader concern across design, which people have mentioned before.
Right.
I also think, again, it's a very safe space once you're in the hackathon. But, what's always interesting, so I really study projects for a living. And, what it takes to organize a hackathon in the first place, which is a very classic live event. It has a beginning time. It has an end time. You just mentioned how you're like very thoughtful about how you structure the invitees. The logistics of organizing 6 or 8 buses from all across the United States, that's a fairly detailed, organized thing.
Totally.
Highly linear, waterfall as we like to call it, highly linear, and also very, very explicitly role dependent, right? Like not for nothing, nobody on the bus decided to swap with the bus driver and drive for 6 hours while the bus driver started to code. Like there's actually like a demarcation there. And I just always think that's interesting because there's a huge amount of work in the world that demands, including all live events, frankly, and things like skyscrapers, mechanical engineering, a whole variety of fields that demand a very different approach than what a pure hackathon is. That isn't to say the stuff that happens inside the hackathon. That isn't to say that some of the best parts of it can't be taken out, which I do believe a lot of people are working on and playing with. And I think this is a lot of the experimentation around things like Kanban and Scrum and some of these others. But I just think the environment that makes a hackathon safe in the first place is that all this other external stuff has been taken care of by some third party, in this case you, that they just don't have to worry about.
Mm-hmm.
And the future of work is not safe spaces for all of us, unfortunately.
No.
And so how do you, I just think the discussion about hackathons is always a conversation about how great it is inside the room, but nobody talks about setting up the room in the first place and like what that is and how it works. And, I would like to see 6 developers set up a hackathon for 1,000 people. I would like to watch that in real time and see what happens. And they've never done it before, and they've never handled insurance and catering and bathrooms at capacity and, all of this stuff. So they are different skill sets. So, I mean, if the idea of today's, because I know we're closing out on time, I absolutely believe the best of what hackathons have to offer is kind of the best in any power sharing environment that really works. And I think it can be really optimal for learning. And I think people can really walk away from it with lots of great stuff. I just don't think it's necessarily applicable for all environments everywhere, how it would fit into corporate governance, and how it would reach populations in a time of increasing income and opportunity inequality.
Well, it's a lot to attack. I don't know. I mean, I think that it is focused on the individual. I mean, I would push back that, like, I'm a developer who got to be an organizer for a hackathon, and many of the people who were organizers for Startup Bus, at least, were developers who had to push themselves into business roles and learn how to be organizers. So I've seen it happen. Like, I know that it can happen, but it does, and I think that it's just a little bit about, what is the balance between what the individual can do and what the organization can do, I do
want to, just to stop that, I don't want to say that developers are incapable of doing it. I actually don't think that at all. But what I do think is, like, when you think about how you really sit down and share tasks and roles and responsibilities in the middle of a hackathon, that typically isn't how you would physically set up the event. It wouldn't be like day 1, you're handling pizza, and then day 2, somebody else is going to handle pizza. And then day 3, we're going to switch our location for the 5th time. Like, there's a lot of much more sort of solid, predictable, locked in pieces. Does that make sense? In terms of tasks and specific details.
True.
But no, I'm not saying developers can't organize parties. Go for it. They're good at it. They're good at all things. They're very smart. I just meant that, if you haven't done it before, it can be a real challenge. And
totally.
Again, for that type of project, the very fluidity that serves them so well inside the hackathon, I argue, would not work nearly as well for something outside of it. That's my broader point.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair, having been somebody who organized a hackathon in the past, is that, like, there is a lot. But, I mean, it's the same thing as, like, a classroom being a formalized version of what might exist in the real world. I mean, I think in some ways it's like that's not the point of the hackathon. It's like the hackathon's trying to give you a microcosm of an experience in a way, but and it is artificial by nature because that's what it's meant to be. It's not a real version of the real world.
But again, the framing question was how this is a model for future work. Yeah. And I actually think as a model, a lot of people do try to run with a lot of this. Like, I worked for a CEO who told me he wanted a Lord of the Flies working environment.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
So, which actually arguably is like day 3 of a hackathon. Hopefully the good parts of a hackathon and not like the fiery inferno that happened in Lord of the Flies.
Yeah.
And, but I mean, I think what he was talking about, hopefully he also meant competition in a good way. Again, hopefully he didn't read the last couple chapters of the book. I would not wish a fiery inferno upon my staff, but whatever.
Yeah.
But again, I just think, and I agree, I don't think the point is how effectively can we order pizza, but I do think it is about, if this is such a great experience, sure, we can take away from it for WeWork, by the way, who does a lot of this stuff, and is the whole argument of WeWork in the first place, that you should be in this physical space together. It will grow your team and your community. That's their whole thing. Whether you're Uber, whether you're General Electric, because all of these guys are pulling, literally also creating hackathons, but also trying to sort of take elements of this into the workplace.
Right.
I just think it's dangerous if we're going to say this is the only thing that's good, which I don't think we are, but that would be my take on our framing question.
No, yeah, and I would maybe just limit it to certain sort of parts of the experience, which is like, I think the team forwarding parts are important for the future of work. I think that the future of work is something where people are going to have to be somewhat fluid and self-organizing in some ways. I think companies that are doing well in this century are companies that that are sort of like thinking about not just a sort of traditional manager employee role, but how do teams sort of self-organize or basically come up with a common sort of goal or system that works for them is maybe one component of it. And then the other component of it is like, how does an individual within sort of a team, whether that be a company or a hackathon team, fluidly move between, roles based upon changing circumstances. I think those two elements kind of taken in isolation are things that are positive that could help, in sort of the work situation. But I totally agree with you that like that doesn't mean that everything should be chaos. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. And I agree with you about the components. And I just think there's an important self-awareness that they're being really fluid in roles inside the structure of the predefined hackathon. Right. They're not actually being fluid in terms of roles, again, of being the bus driver or the guy that makes the pizza or the guy that cleans as the janitor. And there's a lot of inaccessibility within that. And so just as a frame. So, saying, yes, we take these components is great. And then also saying, wow, here are the ways hackathons maybe doesn't serve the entire population at large. How can I, and, the other person that's often not invited to the party inside the hackathon is anyone from government. So anyone regulatory, which remains my concern, given that we have software products of incredible power. Totally. So say your whole hackathon is about creating a new financial services app, which could be very handy and could help lots of people and could even help, a lower income population. Great. There's 1,000,001 regulations there. So, data, banking, privacy, etc. So again, I just think it's components for sure with caveats.
Right.
But again, as I mentioned before, certainly when it goes well and when these components are really realized, I call them ideals, it's enormously beneficial for people.
Right. Totally.
Which hopefully in turn would benefit an organization.
Yeah.
I think also what's interesting is, and maybe you can speak to this because I haven't seen many business hackathons, is very rarely is it about maximizing profit.
The hackathon, you mean?
Yeah. That's not the goal.
No, because usually the ones that are more business oriented are oriented specifically towards like a startup model. So like, how do you get funding? So you do sort of look at like modeling out, a growth plan, for example, and perhaps like how do you get traction, things like that. But yeah. It's certainly a little bit more Shark Tanky in that way, where it's like, and then at the end, like somebody just gives you $1 million to go develop your idea. You know what I mean? Like it's not so much about how do we improve on an existing thing. Although, flip side, now that I say that, is that one of my favorite hackathons that wasn't one that I organized was called Space Apps by NASA, and like the theme of that hackathon, while not business oriented, kind of fulfills a similar goal where it's like NASA, the theme, they basically were sitting down, they have all this data. NASA just collects like images and data on stars and all this stuff. And they just sit on this mountain of data, they just keep collecting it, and they're like, we don't have enough resources to do anything with this stuff. And so somebody came up with the idea of Space Apps Hackathon, where they invite people from all over the world. It's like a single day, and there's multiple hackathons happening all over the world on the same day. As far as I know, it's still running. I could be wrong, and maybe it's been shelved for a while, but it's a great hackathon where basically people have to figure out, what do you do with this space data? And like, how do you turn it into stuff? And in a way that sort of achieves, it sort of does get use out of it, although the goal in that case isn't profit, but it is to kind of like, lengthen, the efforts to expand them beyond what the organization is able to do kind of internally.
Yeah, I know we're drifting a little from the profit thing, but I definitely think across the board, when I think of hackathons, I think they're trying to solve a very specific problem. And it sounds like with some of them, there's more this promise of a check at the end. Great. And I think that does remain the focus. It's interesting that you mentioned NASA because, NASA is actually one of the big reasons the field of project management in the United States was invented. Especially 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, like the bureaucracy you would see to build a spaceship is just like breathtaking. I mean, it would really, anyone who works in sort of a more fluid format today would just be amazed at the literal cartons of documentation that would go with every project. And they had very, very rigid hierarchies and a ton of bureaucracy and a lot of, whether it's hackathons or, again, agile, this set of ideas, a lot around the early 2000s was really to break down those layers of bureaucracy. So it's kind of not without irony that like one of the very cool hackathons is one of the organizations that like so much of these ideas really were in response to their rigidity in the first place, which is just fascinating. And and in a way that gets to my next point too, is like, wow, so they had this cool hackathon and, you know, it sounds like they're solving some interesting problems. And again, if we're getting to what's going to happen after 2020, and in the just crazy state that we're in right now with all these world events, to be fluid and to be able to be flexible and to be able to normalize with others in a team environment is going to be critical.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But again, because I have yet to see an article that even mentions this, like the very minimum basics it takes to set up the hackathon in the first place is a whole set of stuff that's not available to most people everywhere. Mm-hmm. And how do we make that more available to all people so that they too can experience what a hackathon or just a very flourishing problem-solving environment can be for them as well? That's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough problem to solve, but I guess it's like the way I would think about it, because it is an educational experience in my mind, is that like, you know, the cost of going to a college is astronomically higher than the cost of going to a hackathon, even if you were to fly out somewhere and you didn't have access to it. You know, so I think it is worth considering, and a lot of hackathons these days do happen at universities. Sidebarring a fact that I have a friend who runs hackathons, like a hackathon company where they organize hackathons for universities. So.
I mean, and I can't speak to this more broadly, but it does seem like a lot of the training in the engineering space does happen outside of college.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much that will catch on in other industries.
Yeah.
Though I do still think college has merit, even if I think their current business model has some challenges.
Well, these are all good thoughts. Did we kind of get close to what you were thinking about in terms of hackathons and like why I like them and how it fits into the future of work? Or
yeah, I mean that was all I was gonna say, is I think they're great and I think they have limits. Yeah. That's all I was trying to get at.
Well, I just wanted to check in that there was anything else that you
No, that was it. Just inclusivity and like what are basic needs. But I always talk about this, you know. Yeah. That's me. So, yeah.
Perfect. So, thanks Eve again for a great episode about hackathons. Tell the audience how they can get in touch with you.
Thanks again. I'm Eve. It's at littleowl.us is my website. And on Facebook, I'm on facebook.com/littleowl with a 1 at the end. On the events section is a list of all my upcoming classes.
Perfect. See you again.
Thanks for tuning in to learn with us today. This has been the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast sponsored by Swarm. Don't forget to go to swarmnyc.com/learn. There you can sign up for our email newsletter and connect with us on social media.
Thanks, Eve. And again, my name is Nate Cooper. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great day and happy learning.